Very cool. Given the utility of logic, we become masters of natural logic by thinking. Yet thinking and having thoughts are different. The object of our study in these lectures is to gain knowledge of thinking, to know what we as thinking beings are. A human being is spirit, Geist, and to come to know what lies therein is our highest achievement. Whatever a human being is, we are truly human only insofar as we know who we are. A human being bears within him or herself a right to such knowledge, but the actual possession of what is one's right is still something else. There is no unnatural artificial logic, it is said, but conscious logic, without a doubt, can exist. We receive pure thoughts into our heads, thoughts which are true. We learn how to hold fast to what is universal, and it is by doing so we receive our education and learn how to lift out what is essential. Considerations of utility must not be scorned. We must come to know what is true for itself rather than for external ends, it is said. Yet the other side of the matter is again utility. God sacrificed himself on the cross within the natural world for the sake of the world of individual human beings. Thus, what upon and for itself is most excellent also proves to me most useful. We come to approach our subject still more closely as we now consider thinking, which belongs to consciousness. We human beings think, animals do not. Thinking is called a mental power, a faculty, embracing feeling, representation, imagination. The faculty of thinking, taken as a whole, is known as a theoretical mind. Is known as theoretical mind. Beyond theoretical mind lies the will, the faculty of desire. Thinking at once falls to intelligence, to which representation and intuition also belong. Thinking is said to be one mental faculty, one activity, one among others. Each power is to be taken independent, and the soul is imagined to be what holds such and such faculties within itself. The soul is taken to be a kind of external medium, Umgebung, in which every faculty independently operates for itself on its own account. When such representations are used, we speak of mental powers, and also relate to them to one another through determining each to be tacked on as also present. What we have here is only external compounding. Our immediate consciousness is held within the limits of such categories. We also represent mind as a one in which everything is contained. If we inquire into the relation between these activities, it must be said that to be human is to think. But what is thinking? What does it do? It is nothing apart from what is universal. Thinking produces the universal, and it is by doing so that thinking is thinking. If it is said with Kant that thinking forms concepts or brings manifold representations into unity, such a statement is superficial to the extent that every representation, every sensation is already both one and upon itself a manifold. The earmark of thinking is rather the form of the universal which it produces. This earmark first makes its appearance in assertions and definitions, and it requires for itself proofs. We cannot simply appeal to representation in establishing what is said here of thinking. What is to be said here is only the introduction or preliminary to the science of logic. What we adduce here is more properly historical, affording only a representation of the science. In the science itself, it will be seen that the universal for itself, on its own account, is necessary, that the other forms revert back to it, that it is what is true. The universal is the product of thinking, but in this preliminary exposition, the universal form is taken up merely empirically. We represent thinking to ourselves as an activity. As an activity, thinking is the universal in its activation. Very important. Thinking as an activity is the universal in its activation. The universal is the form by which something is thought. Thinking is active, and the result of its deeds is what is thought, regardless of the content by which thinking is affected, in which thinking imposes universality. The subject, the thinking subject, is the I. That the I is essentially the thinking subject may at once take us by surprise. We represent to ourselves the I as a proliferating in particular determinations in this range of knowledge. We represent it as wholly concrete I. Yet what exists out there for us to take up as its abstract essence free of any particular content is merely the I, the thinking subject. Thinking, having concepts, seems far removed from us, but it is in fact what is closest at hand. In thinking, I remain absolutely at home with myself. I am myself this thinking. This close proximity of thinking, this immediate oneness of thinking and myself, also impresses itself on us. We represent thinking to ourselves as separable from the I, but it is in fact what is most present in it. If we say I go, I am suffering, I am pleased, the I remains ever present in these determinations, Bestimmtheiten, of my state, of my interest or will. I can thus be determinate in multiple ways. Now I feel, now I don't, I now instead of will, and so it goes. Yet in all these determinations, I remain as the common thread of it all. Put differently, I accompany all these representations as Kant has it. Accompany, however, does not say enough. I am entirely invested in these representations. There's no escaping the ego. Yet I am not merely the common thread among all these determinations. A determination held in common is a bad form of the universal by which diverse things are compared as similar. Comparison is an external reflection on things that does not belong to the things themselves. So the I is not merely common to all things by comparison, but is rather absolutely these things all at once and all taken in only once. Yet I am also, in my self-abstraction for things, merely universal, and as such I am on the contrary free of every one of these things. The mere I is not only intuiting, feeling, and so on, but is also at once none of these. It's universal. If feeling, intuition belong to my very nature, I could not be without it. The I stands in its freedom above all these things. I posit myself absolutely as simple self-reference. The I is a pure thought space, which, like sensory space, can be filled in an infinitely various manner. The I is thus perfectly simple, bearing reference only to itself, and freedom of thought lies precisely in this simple self-reference. Thinking in its determinateness is the concrete universal, but I can also abstract from everything. Thinking in its determinateness is the concrete universal, but I can also abstract from everything. The I in this self-abstraction is completely empty, which is what among the East Indians has passed for what is most high. In this emptiness, I am this completely unitary individual. I negate everything and exclude all. Just so is infinite singularity present in the I, which once again also contains absolutely concrete determinateness. But in saying I, invoking this absolutely singular being of mine, I say directly the opposite of singularity, for everyone says I in reference to him or herself. The word I which I say means everyone. The I, in this its singularity, is at once completely universal. I'm the thinking subject. The I illustrates the self-concept by existing throughout for itself alone, merely on its own account. Okay, I will reread. The I illustrates the self-concept by existing throughout for itself alone, merely on its own account. Thinking is the universal taken as active. The universal is first what is abstract. By a concept, we usually understand a determinate representation of the imagination. But in the science of logic, the concept is something completely different, of which the I provides an example. This singular subject is immediately united with the I. Only as this singular thinking subject does thinking lay hold of truth, and its product is whatever is thought, the universal. The I is thus most contradictory, being completely universal and at once perfect singularity. From where we now stand before the onset of the science of logic, the claim that I and thinking are completely identical can only be based on an appeal to representation. Logic is the science of truth. Logic is the science of truth. What is purely abstract is totally lacking in truth, and singularity, considered abstractly merely for itself, is untrue. Okay, those are so crucial.
Damn, dude, this whole section is just
This is epic
fucking
stuff.
blowing my mind right now. I feel like he's just giving us it's just it's brilliant.
Yeah.
I'm okay to keep reading, but I mean it's just I'm tingling over here.
I have a paper full of this, like notes. I've been furiously taking notes.
Yeah. Yeah, this is crazy. Logic is the science of truth, and science of logic is the science of the science of truth.
I mean, this I as the completely universal and perfectly singular is just a hell of a fucking idea, though.
We can start talking now, I think.
Yeah, what is purely
we could,
lacking in truth.
Well, there he's negating,
Yeah, we can finish like maybe until the next point arises. What do you think? Or do we start talking now?
I'm down to keep reading.
Yeah,
whatever.
I'm keep reading, yeah.
Let's go.
On the distinction between sensory objects, representations, and thoughts. In common parlance, representation and thought are interchanged promiscuously. But the difference is a matter of high importance. Religion is on the whole held within representations, while science thinks representations. First comes what is sensory, and it will be said that what is sensory falls to the senses. But how are the senses determined? How is what is sensory so constituted that it lies within senses? A sensory object is determined as immediately singular. I have a singular sensory intuition only at this determinate time, at this moment, absolutely situated within in space and time, and this intuition is immediately determinate. The simple character of whatever is sensory, as likewise the simple thought of determination of what is sensory is singular in its immediacy. I, like any sensory object, am also singular, but the singularity of the I, unlike that of a sense object, is mediated by universality. The singularity of the I is mediated by universality. I am singular only insofar as I am mediated by universality, just as the I is universality only as mediated by singularity. The I exhibits singularity raised to the level of pure universality. What is sensory, by contrast, shows only abstract singularity. But a human being as a person, as an agent of action and willing, is what, from its beginning as sensory, has raised itself within the I to the level of universality. Okay. The object of sensory intuition is a manifold that is richer than mere sensation. But the manifold activity of combining that results in the intuiting of such an object is itself singular. The manifold character of determinations is separate from them. In intuition, we have the object of intuition in a single one, and the combination of singular determinations likewise always occur in a singular manner. Representing the object of intuition is still further. In sensation, the object, assuming it is an external object, exists in interconnection with our own corporeal nature and external being. Representation, unlike sensory intuition, is taken up for itself without the immediate reference of intuition to one's body in its external environs. For I can have an image of an object without standing immediately in front of it, without physical contact with it. The representation resides essentially within me. The I as the simple universal is the self bearing reference solely to itself. Thus, if a manifold of intuition lies within me as a simple being, that manifold sensory material comes to be simplified by me. Insofar as this material enters me, it must enter the I reduced to a point, and this point affects the sensory material with its own simplicity. We find this already to be the case with images. In the external intuition of objects, I myself am more externalized than I am with the representations of imagination. In the external intuition of objects, I myself am more externalized than I am with the representations of imagination. The image of an object is always more indeterminate than the sensory intuition of it. Within representation, individual points are no longer determinate as they were within external intuition. Further, the image lies within me, within the universal space of representation belonging to universal time, something I carry around with me while changing my location in sensory space. Representations are more simplified than objects of sensory intuition. Their form is simplicity itself, universality itself. Representation is thus more spiritual than a sensory object. Representation is more spiritual than a sensory object. Two things to be distinguished in representation are its form and its content. Its content is twofold: sensory content and thought content. Quite generally, the form of representation resides within me. Representation and thinking, even more so, epitomizes. They're compendium-like. For example, I represent myself a battle which, within sensory intuition, is completely infinite, is of the most infinitely manifold character. But the representation of being a battle is totally compendium-like. The battle in its existence, as immediately represented, is not as simple as it is in subsequent representation. So there's a reduction happening. To cite another example, I know blue as a particular color by sight, but as completely simple as my representation of blue is, the color blue exists amid an infinite swarm of other objects. If I leave everything other than blue aside, blue cannot exist merely for itself in an isolated state without contrast to other objects. Here we become active in analysis and composition. This activity of analysis and composition begins in representation as an act of simplifying and generalizing what is particular. Here, our own conscious activity of negating or abstracting finds its onset. The onset is in the activity of analysis and composition and simplification and generalization. Here we find the activity of representing by images generally, so that's universally. A representation is isolated and is simple relative to what it represents within its isolation. A representation may stem from without, from the senses, or it may stem from the mind, Geist, but is not yet the self-concept, even if it may still be labeled as a thought. I unite separated determinations of an object, for example, of a flower in my representation, in my image of it. What we have is the unifying of a manifold. Such unifying acts of representation proliferate. There are many acts of uniting. Philosophy lies merely in sheer acts of unifying manifolds. But at this stage, in representation before the onset of philosophy, external determinations come to be bound together conjunctively by an also. As belonging to a subject, they come to be recounted one after the other, but the subject itself is, as it were, the rigid self-same point to which they all belong. Our representations of the properties do not bind themselves to one another on their own. Rather, they remain isolated over against one another. They come to be bound together only externally in a third thing. The chief characteristic of representation is that the references which the things bear to each other in representation lie within a third thing. The understanding posits essential referential relations, referring to terms such as cause and effect, but has no insight into the necessity of the relation. Religion is full of representations, but again, it lacks the insight by a self-same subject into the necessary relation of the determinations as one after another they come to be recounted. Any insight into such necessity is lost on representation as such. Thinking is simply something else than representing. To thinking as such belongs whatever is universal. The forms lying upon our representations are the very content of thinking. Thinking is their activations. Thinking has to do merely with the forms as such. The question arises as to the worth of these forms. Thinking is in its product purely universal. Representations are given as determinate and in isolation alongside one another. Thoughts are as universal as representations, but yet a referential relation enters into thought. The mutual reference of cause and effect is a thought. Through the positing of the one and the other is also already posited. So likewise, with the whole and its parts, these determinations necessarily bear reference to each other. The two determinations, holding forth in their independence, even while bearing reference to each other, distinguish the understanding from the self-concept. Thinking is what is universal. That is, to think is to universalize, to generalize the singular or particular determination into a universal as the product of thinking. Sensory intuitions and feelings are singular, yet the determinations such as singularity at once exhibits universality, for all things are singular. Singularity is shared by them all. That is, all things are singular, but when thought or predication attributes singularity to them, it also makes them into something universal. Singularity is thus not separated from universality. Thought is itself and yet reaches out into what is other than itself. Okay, so let's stop right here. This part, thought is itself and yet reaches out to what is other than itself, also touches the dimension we talked about before, about space and time. The third thing.
The third perspective. But I think that's a product of here Hegel is distinguishing thinking and representation. And I think this third perspective, this third person thing is a product of representation and not thinking, which is an activity.
Let's go to that section where he talks about the third thing.
Yeah.
Because yeah.
Let's keep the screen share. Yeah. So many good stuff.
Oh my God, I feel sort of like
yeah,
overwhelmed. Yeah.
If we had gone further, we didn't have to have that entire conversation about simplicity. Here Hegel explains it.
Yeah, the simplicity of self-referential simplicity.
But I think that.
But I think it's fun to kind of play in that.
No,
you know, I think we intuited it. I think that's what we were saying. It's the simplicity.
I think we got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we did.
Basically.
I think we did, dude. I think we sublated Hegel. Let's go.
Yeah. I take it.
Let's go to the club. Yeah.
Let's go to the thing. The third thing, rather.
Yeah.
So he says here, it's right on page 10. So he says, philosophy lies merely in sheer acts of unifying manifolds. But at this stage in representation, before the onset of philosophy, external determinations come to be bound together conjunctively by an also. As belonging to a subject, they come to be recounted one after the other. But the subject itself is, as it were, the rigid self-same point to which they all belong. That's the simplicity, right? The self-reference. Our representations of the properties do not bind themselves to one another on their own, Rather, they remain isolated over against one another. They come to be bound together only externally in a third thing. Externally is an interesting word to use there. The chief characteristic of representation is that the references which two things bear in each other in representation lie within a third thing. The understanding posits essential referential relations, referring to terms such as cause and effect, but has no insight into the necessity of the relation. Religion is full of representations, but again, it lacks insight by a self-same object into the necessary relation of determinations.
So that is really, maybe that's Hegel's project, is that there is a necessity to the relation that no one has ever thought before. Is that, maybe that's it,
Yeah.
because he
I wanna hear you got, if any of you have an interpretation of it, because like I think
well,
yeah, go ahead.
okay, so
How do you
the
yeah.
understanding, it does get referential relations, but doesn't get that it's necessary.
Yeah.
The dialectician gets this.
The way I interpret the third thing is as a third perspective. So if we wanna go to conjunction, which is the explanation for causality, right? One thing hits another.
Yeah.
But the necessity of this, it takes the presumption that there is an above perspective that verifies things to be true. I think this is an assumption of representational thinking, but it is not thinking as such. This is not thinking as such. In thinking as such, we see that it is an activity, which is to say that it follows the rigid simplicity, right? Right. It has to be self-referential in order to understand its nature. And this is why you cannot have a third perspective. It always fails.
Or it's
So
yeah,
yeah.
that's interesting, Jason. Yeah, how I was reading that, and now I think I understand why. Because I was like, at first I was perplexed by his use of the word externally, because I was thinking of
Right.
the third thing as the self relation,
Sublation.
as a kind of, okay, maybe, yeah, I was thinking the third thing as the negative which binds them, or the negative of the self, of the simplicity of the self relation. But
It
it's
kind
almost
of
like
is.
he's critiquing the third thing as kind of a positive view from nowhere, kind of this positive godlike view from above that can verify these things. He's sort of saying this externality, this external cognition is impossible. You are already
it's a
the
realism.
activity of thinking itself.
It's a realism of the truth as outside of you. He also talks about the separation of thought and being there somewhere. If I can organize my note here. But you guys keep talking. But that's how I interpret that section. What and then the contrast would be thinking in itself, which is also for itself. It has to, because he connects it to thinking as an act through use, right? Through utility, which is the for itself of thing.
And he equates excellence with utility, which is very interesting. Isn't Hegel the ultimate pragmatist in that sense?
He also says, and I think this is the difference between him and Kant. Kant, he says that thinking is one amongst many. There's many ways you can think, whereas Kant goes like, oh, there is correct thinking, because he goes with this representational. He falls into the representational trap, and he wants to have a correct representation. But Hegel is saying it's always a represented. It's always a manifold. He says that somewhere here, right? When Kant wants to have a singular out of a manifold through the categories. But Hegel is saying, well, things always appears as a manifold in the first place. You know, you cannot have space without the rest of the other stuff.
So there's a sensory, there's the intuition,
yeah,
which is coming into immediate contact with the singularity of an object that you sense. Then there's the representation, the Vorstellung, in which, you know, like Vorstellung means literally to put forth. You're putting something forth, an image. And then there is the notional thinking, or the scientific thinking. And that is also how spirit science, science of logic, go beyond religion. Because religion and the representational thinking, just like understanding, can have no understanding of the necessity. Now, one word that's missing here is reason. Does reason understand the necessity?
But that's
Maybe he's gonna go
that's
into it in like 1 page, 2 pages.
yeah,
Who
literally,
knows?
right? Yeah, I know. But let's speculate here. It's as Quinn says, it's fun. I think this is tied. This is tied back to the fact that thinking is one amongst many, and reason is one of the ways in which thinking appears. He also says there's somewhere that the thinking self, that we think, is a theoretical mind. And I think this is this you can tie this back to what we said earlier about the presuppositionless philosophy, where all you do is theorize. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, you theorize, and then you see, that's, yeah. I don't know if that connects to what you said.
Say it again, Jason. Sorry, I was just reading.
I don't know. I don't know if that's I don't know if that connects to what you said, but somewhere on the top of what we read earlier, he was talking about we think, animals don't, right? He said something like that.
Yeah.
And then he elaborates further that we think is a feature of a theoretical mind or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that can be connected to a presuppositionless philosophy, where it's not the theory as such, but that you theorize at all is the main feature, is again in action.
Right. Yeah,
The
it's
form,
not
content.
sort of right. It's not, or it's not, sort of focused necessarily on the degree to which our concept is, holds holds a relationship with its referent, with its object. It's now, he talks about the fact that we can have representations without objects. We have imagination, right? We have the ability to think representations without being triggered by a certain sensory object, a sensory intuition.
He also says something that on the top in the beginning of what we read, I think he said something that can be connected to, like, there is no meta language, when he says there is no artificial logic. There's no logic above logic. There's no way we can come.
What about artificial intelligence?
See that? But I think that's
interesting.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
There he says here, representations are more simplified than objects of sensory intuition. Their form is simplicity itself, universality itself. Representation is thus more spiritual than a sensory object. Two things to be distinguished in representation are its form and content. Its content is twofold: sensory content and thought content.
Thought, yeah. Oh no, continue.
No, yeah, actually, that's where he makes a point that quite generally the form of representation resides within me. Representation and thinking even more epitomizes. What do you think he means by epitomizes? I didn't really understand this.
Exemplifies. Where are you at?
Page, the end of 9 and the beginning of 10. Representation and thinking even more epitomizes. He also has this word he uses multiple times, compendium. I'm not even sure what that means.
Representation and thinking. Okay, there it is. Representation and thinking even more so epitomizes. But what does it epitomize? Right? I'm missing that.
Maybe you can connect it to like what he said about representation. No, the I being more external than representation, or something like that. And I think what the key word here is external. You know, what does that mean to externalize? And I think that's more like is your sense of realism. What do you think? Go ahead. Anyway.
I think that the I is completely universal and perfectly singular, because that's what Hegel says.
There we go.
I don't know what it means, but it sounds
Very
pretty
nice.
nice.
Yeah.
It's, yeah, I mean, I do feel like I can kind of quite get at it, because like there is this singularity of the I, but the moment you start thinking about that, you go to the universal I.
Yeah, the I is
Yeah,
both
exactly.
a commonality and a distinction, right? That's what he said somewhere, where it connects everything, but it's precisely that which is not that.
It's that which is not that.
Yeah.
Yeah, this connection between the singular and the universal is fascinating. And I'm curious
Yeah.
kind of to bring it back to this notion of the third the third thing, or how to think this I. He says he says in the I feel like there's like a basic confusion that happens where the third thing, or the I, maybe this is when it sort of becomes the spatially and temporally calcified ego, is when it sort of thinks of itself as the causal agent of thinking. It sort of separates itself from the activity of thinking and sees itself as this external perspective, right? As this kind of view from the outside. And it seems like he's trying to point to, because he says this right a lot, it's like thinking as the activity itself.
Yeah,
he,
so
he
this
says he says, in thinking I am at home with myself.
and also the subject is the thinking. The I is the thinking subject. He also explicitly says this. But what I just lost it. It was a very fragile thought, delicate.
Yeah.
I feel like
we're
I've had a lot
reaching
of
we're reaching
fragile
that
thoughts.
Yeah.
I feel I'm hitting up. Yeah, there's just a blankness. I have a thought and
Just
then it
went
just gets swallowed by
Yeah.
the void.
No,
Man,
this is very crystalline stuff. Very hard.
Hegel's
Yeah.
just a madman, dude. It's just like
Yeah.
fuck.
the absolute
But
madman.
yeah, I mean, I think that's why, for to Dimitri, it's sort of like the difference between thinking the subject as negativity versus the subject as a positive content, right?
Right.
That to me is how I've been thinking this
So
this confusion. Like for example, he says this in the phenomenology. Let me know what you think. He says, at first, the I distinguishes itself from its object, and there's this negativity between the I and the object. And it's sort of, he says, it's experienced as an abhorrence, or it's like it's painful, this distinction. But it's treating the I as a positive content, a positive substantial thing, as separate from its object, and the negativity is that which rests between it, that it tries to overcome through its representational thinking. It wants to overcome the negativity that is the distinction between this I and its object.
And
then
that's
at
the
a certain
self. That's
point,
the actual subject.
yeah.
but that, and then at a certain point, the I realizes itself as this negativity. And and that
or it
that,
may not, or it may not. It can just be
or
stuck in the circuit
of course,
of
right,
having
of
this
course.
third person. Yeah.
Of course, maybe no, right, of course. But if it tries to aspire towards absolute knowing,
Yeah.
it realizes itself as this negativity, which seems to be in and of itself the activity of thinking,
Yes.
which is precisely this connection between the universal and the singular.
So is Hegel asking us to be to go back to atheism a little bit? Is Hegel asking us here to be kind of an atheist? You
No.
must dump the third position. You must dump the big other.
Yes.
Dimitri,
If
go
God,
ahead.
yes.
I disagree.
You disagree? Why?
Yeah, because in the philosophy of religion, I will never forget this. We says that God is love, and when we are saying something like that, we are
Yeah.
saying something very great and true.
But you know, I agree with
No,
that
but
because
God,
we can't really
but I think-
dump with it. We can't really dump
But
it.
it's all
it has
about
to
how
be.
you, it's all about how you define it too, right? Like
Mhm.
if God is a third, this third factor, this big other,
Right.
this picture thought, right? Then in
Yeah.
the religion chapter, it has to be negated and superseded, and that's where it goes to
Right.
the absolute knowing, right? Of course, but from the stage of absolute knowing, we can retrospectively then think about God, as love
So
disporting
we
itself
must
with
update.
itself, right?
We must
That's what they said.
update God. We must sublate God. We must
Yeah,
figure.
and
Yeah,
I
I
think
don't think
that
it's about just dismissing it as sort of
Absolutely.
like
I
that. The
agree.
atheist move is like, oh, God is the
I agree. But
this being in the sky as
it's
the
stuck
sort
with
of like,
but I
negation.
argue it's this the content is different, but it's the same movement. To become an atheist through Hegel and to sublate God through Hegel. I think it's the same thought gesture.
Yeah, for sure.
It's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same thought gesture, but the content
absolutely.
is
As long as you don't,
Right.
as long as you don't do away with the religious layer and say it's unnecessary.
Of course.
You know,
That's
it's
banal. That's banal atheism.
right,
Yeah.
right, sure,
You know,
right.
I think Marx really said this the best way is that atheists are like children who try to convince you that the boogeyman doesn't scare them. You know, like,
Right.
oh yeah, the God is not real. God is not real. He's just a fiction. And you're going around telling all these people this. Why? Like,
Right.
okay, God is a none other. It is like kind of the essence of God is beyond being. It's negative to our comprehension,
But then it becomes
but it's
like
positivized
us.
also,
But
in appearance.
yeah. But the way we overcome God is to return it back to ourselves, right? Because you will arrive at the same property. You know, God is this non thing. You know, this other that is self similar. You know, but it's not that. It's beyond all objects and so on.
I
It's
think
the
that's
same.
what, yeah.
It's the same as it's the same meaning as the self. It's what you know.
Yep. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah,
It's so
substance
interesting
also
though.
subject.
Hmm?
It's substance and also subject.
Right.
Yeah.
This interesting though the that you bring up love, Dimitri. I don't want to get too off topic. We can come back to it, but that because that's something that I've that it's just it's because it's very not love's very non-logical. You know, love's just like this profound kind of feeling. So to hear, you know, as the master of logos, it's interesting that Hegel was talking about God as love. You know.
Yeah. Right.
Love is also substance and subject, right? You can't reduce it to chemical processes. You can't, you know, like there is a there's a stupidity. There's a failure to it. Like I fall in love with someone.
Oh, you can even support it with science. Zizek talks about this, that if you look at the animal world, the chimp will look in the social hierarchy and be like, okay, this chimp I can get, this chimp not, she's too hot. And humans don't function that way, but a lot of humans, they love to self-sabotage themselves and keep trying to get that girl who doesn't want them, but they want it. And like that dimension emerges with spirit. That's what she
right. Because you have to have heard of this kind of love before. This is something you must this is something that I think is how Zizek explained religious believers where I believe that other people believe and so on. Like I think love works like that too, where there is this thing called love. You know how love in America is like mostly a marketing sort of definition. It's like
Like
that.
everything.
Right. But I think that is also part of love, right? That there's a kind of
You
cynical
market
aspect to
yourself.
love. Yeah. That's the kind of a spirit, you know. Oh, speaking of definition, I think um on the top he said something like um truth is not mere definition. Like the truth is like a historical truth as opposed to a definition because the definition is like a is a definition relates to the assertion that makes it, whereas truth is related to history. Truth is,
Yeah.
yeah.
To
I
the
thought that was a great sort of rectangle of relationship.
yeah. What do you guys think about freedom? That was interesting in what in relation to what we were talking about earlier. That it seems like people want to get out of this, like they want to get out of the simple self-reference, and they try to do external cognition where you have this positivized big other looking down being the third thing. Like whatever means
Yep.
necessary, I just want to get out of my own skin. Like Nietzsche would say, that's what these people think. So Hegel says no, that's not actually um, the claustrophobia you feel by being a subject, like there, so many that's also, I would argue, the reason that people want to be non-binary. They don't want to be a sexuated subject in this. Oh, I feel so claustrophobic. But Hegel says no, that's not. You're not like increasing your freedom there, because the freedom is in the simple self-reference. And I thought
Yeah.
that was very
Exactly.
interesting.
Right.
Doesn't
Yeah, yeah.
And
The kind of
OG Rosa's paper talks about this in the absolute choice, where you it's a kind of, I think freedom is one of those concepts where you can make an unfree choice, you can make an unfree decision and so on, but you can also make a free decision, and that requires, I think, risk. It's one of those things, one of those ambiguity.
absolutely.
It's,
Yeah,
yeah, because I think that the ground of that is the simple
right,
self-reference,
right. I
right?
don't think we can here do freedom like the way in analytic philosophy where you either have it or you don't. I think humanity, by virtue of the fact that the subject can self-other, means that we can both be free and unfree simultaneously. And to be free is an act, that requires risk and so on. Because an unfree decision is like a logical decision, right? It's like you're not putting anything; it just sort of happened.
Well, I think like that
What do you?
perhaps you have to be in. So maybe, like, I mean, it's super interesting the point you say, and I think that if you're not allowed to tap into the groundlessness of your simple self-reference, then you're unfree.
Right.
I
So
mean, yeah, and
yeah,
it's sort of like if if your choices are motivated by a desire to overcome that groundless negativity, or you see it as something to be overcome, right? And you're
trying to
motivated by a desire for sort of self-enclosed symmetrical identity, a kind of A equals A, right? Um that's what you're kind of seeking as the alleviation of this absolute unrest of pure self movement, this
yeah, you're
kind of
trying
an
to flee
infinity,
freedom.
right? Yeah, you're trying to, exactly. Freedom's fucking nauseating, right? Freedom's terrifying.
Yeah,
Freedom is
yeah, yeah, yeah.
communing with that abyssal ground, and then
It has
from
to.
that place, it's like, well, then what? Then you, I think this is where the absolute choice comes in. Is you
Hmm.
then choose to confront absolute otherness, right? Like from that place, you then still choose to not try and continuously uh sort of halt your own self movement, but to actually embrace it fully, to confront the otherness. And I think
Yeah.
it's interesting because, like, I just, like, personal reflection. I've had those moments where I feel like the I realizes itself as this negativity, and that can be incredibly liberating. to commune with that simplicity. But then you can fall back into experiencing that as a kind of nausea, as a kind of like terrifying vertigo, and then you're like, then you fucking want that self-symmetrical sort of static identity again, and then you have to say, okay, fuck, I'm gonna make the choice to go out and confront absolute otherness, which likely means confronting, or actually, yeah, I would say would means confronting the failure of that self-symmetrical identity that I'm striving for, which it probably will involve some emotional negativity, right? So it's like you kind of have to. It's
So
yeah. I
what do
don't
you
know.
think? What do you think the true nature of suffering then? Like how do we understand suffering in its fullest? Is it through realizing that we are alone in all this? You know what I mean? Like how do we, in order to overcome suffering, if we have to eliminate, let's say, this symmetrical relationship, is to admit that this is all there is. I'm at the edge of subjectivity. Is realizing that you are all alone the way out of suffering, maybe.
I think that
Or,
differentiation will always come with suffering,
hmm,
because that's the like there's no suffering in like perfect being. There's no suffering in nothingness
yeah,
if there's no, but this
yeah, it
yeah.
will always be there, right?
I think it's obviously it's such a
I think
challenging.
that's I think
It's
that's
such a
the thing like Girardian, like lynch mobs are trying to get away from differentiation. This is like their spontaneous pagan movement, and they hold on to these undifferentiated things, and then you get all these ideas about returning to a one, and yeah, alleviating suffering by political programs,
right.
like internet
I
of
think that's
AI or something like that, singularity shit.
Yeah.
yeah. It's I think how are we thinking about suffering, right? Like Hegel does talk about this kind of abhorrence, or the unhappy consciousness. So there is
Mm-hmm.
some discontent maybe that we could say can be overcome, but it's not an I wouldn't say it's an overcoming of suffering, right? Or I wouldn't say it's an overcoming of the negativity. It's just a different kind of, I think, relationship to that. So like it's just, yeah, if it's motivated by overcoming suffering or contradiction or the negativity, if your process is motivated by that, it's built on a fundamental lie, right? Because it's neglecting a kind of primordial suffering, a primordial
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
contradiction, a primordial tension. So as long as it's motivated by
I'm just
Nietzsche would say that's a denial of life, right? Like that's trying to
yeah.
deny, that's lusting for a kind of perfect being, lusting for a kind of heavenly state where there's no contradiction. It's like God needs the devil, love needs a sort of
Mm-hmm.
the antagonism of suffering, right? So that I think that's just part of the play. But I do think there is some way of experiencing that process with a little bit more. I mean, Hegel does say a little more joy and freedom, where you sort of almost an enjoyment of the spontaneous becoming. What that looks like, I'm not entirely sure, or whether that could be a permanent state of being, I don't know, right? But there is some, I wouldn't define it as the overcoming of suffering,
Yeah,
but
I
there is
think
some shift in how you experience, I think, the infinity.
absolutely. Agreed. Yeah.
that is the point of absolute knowing. With in the introduction of the phenomenology, he says that consciousness will arrive at a point where it doesn't feel like it's burdened by something alien anymore, because appearance coincides with
Exactly.
consciousness.
Yep.
So this burdening with being, like, okay, so you can have this burden of I have to confront myself with this alien being, but I think absolute knowing is the realization that it's not just otherness, but it's your own otherness.
The alien doesn't dissipate. It's just you don't. It's like you experience it almost as a joyful confrontation with the
Yeah.
alien other, rather than as a burden.
Yeah, and that's totally way different way of becoming, to not, yeah.
And I mean, yeah, in Buddhist literature, in the Bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism is someone who basically, achieve some sort of enlightenment, right? Some sort of absolute knowing. But instead of shooting off into nirvana and kind of separating from the wheel of samsara, it fucking goes right back into samsara and suffering, and is like with this sort of courage and joy. It engages with the world of samsara with a kind of joy, and tries to bring other beings, other sentient beings, to that place. But and it's sort of radical in that it's saying, oh, the goal is the alleviation of sort of the suffering of all sentient beings. But I think there's a deep irony in that process, because in the grandiosity of that proclamation, because it's almost recognizing the impossibility of that, but yet there's still kind of it still dares to proclaim it or something. That's at least a way that I've read it.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's also, I was reading Nietzsche today. At a certain moment, he's saying things like, you don't have this will for pleasure, and don't have this will for like satisfaction. Have a will to pain, go for pain. And Hegel, in the phenomenology, he also says, like, you have to start doubting your doubt. You've to be in complete despair. And then
I really
go to
I
the
really
flow.
think this is the takeaway today. That we
Absolutely.
really that it's A, difficult, and B, painful. It's
As soon as you start trying to overcome discomfort, pain, tragedy, despair,
Right.
suffering, you're dead. You're the fucking Nietzschean
Right.
death worshiper. That's the
Right,
death
right.
drive right there. That's yeah. It's fucking difficult though. It's absolutely difficult.
It takes it very seriously. It takes it in its very like nauseating seriousness. It takes us to a great height. What do you guys think about the statement that logic is the science of truth?
Truth.
I think that was beautiful,
That's a
the way,
banger.
because logic is so hard to define.
That's a banger.
That's an excellent way to put it. It's the science of truth.
Yeah, absolutely.
But okay, you read Daniel Garner's paper. Is truth rational?
I haven't actually read Daniel Garner's paper yet. Oh, have you, Jason?
I'm in the triad. He's me and him and Max. It's the rational truth. I think the truth, the rational truth starts from the irrational. So the truth
Doesn't he use the language of the
contains
non-rational?
yeah, the non-rational. Sorry, not irrational. Sorry, yeah, non-rational. So the rational, when it becomes true, as in, I'm butchering the shit out of it. I'm trying to give
Well,
them.
I haven't actually read his paper, but I have a few ideas about it. I think in some ways, like if AB is this confrontation with absolute otherness, or this kind of this choice, right? Or even the notion, right, that you were saying, and that you presuppose the kind of the end and the beginning, right? So you say there is transformation is possible. I think a fundamental transformation of my being is possible. I can't rationally explain to you why that
there
is.
we go.
I can't say, oh, this is if I do X, Y, and Z, I'll guarantee myself a transformation. It's like, no, you're fucking wagering. You're wagering. It's not an irrational decision, though. And so that's why I think maybe like.
But then it's not absolutely 100%. I totally misspoke. It's not irrational. It's non-rational. But the interesting thing is that then once the truth is revealed, you arrive at AA again, because it becomes rational. The whole thing has to do with explaining the phrase that Hegel said, the truth is the rational, or something. The rational is the true, or something like that. But that's not what it means directly. That's not that's not quite the entire thing. There's more to it. But that misleads a lot of people, into thinking that Hegel is like this. Yeah. But so once it becomes true, it's in the rational scheme of things, and then from there you can speak of it rationally.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting to think about faith in this way, you know, like I'm
Oh
thinking
yeah,
about a Kierkegaardian faith, a leap of faith, you know, and this kind
yeah.
of process of despairing, right? Like it does seem to be like there is some leap involved, right? Where you're making that choice, that absolute choice that is non-rational. Because the ego loves the A equals A
Right.
rational logic, and it wants that kind of guarantee, but there are no fucking guarantees in
There's no
this,
guarantee.
when
Right.
in the absolute choice there is no guarantees, right? That and so it's interesting to think, yeah,
That's
faith in that way.
right. That's the truth of, like, if we want to have a God, let's say, if we want theism, we need to incorporate this indeterminacy, this utter indeterminacy, where God himself is not determined by himself, like, but us as well,
Hmm.
It's this radical kind of openness,
Yeah, absolutely.
which probably makes you very powerful, right? If you can, if you speak about it technologically, if you can overcome, like, I think absolute knowledge, if you think about it technologically, is this constant problem solving, basically. Is where your technology evolves hand in hand with the problem. Yeah, and I think God would be something like that, at the
Mm.
highest point. I don't know. What are you up to, Dimitri? You disappear.
I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about trauma. That it really
Mm.
seems like that the Hegelian philosophy has a different psychical relationship to trauma because you allow the being with the disruption of the process of your life and to take that up instead of recoil from it.
Yeah.
Mm.
But I haven't thought this through deeply enough.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Uh, I think trauma also has like a perspectival dimension to it, right? Where
Mm.
uh, there's this thing, I don't know who said it, but if you're a child and you watch your parents have sex or something, the real trauma begins when you're a teenager, when you can understand what exactly you saw, and then
Yeah, yeah.
retroactively that traumatizes you. So maybe there is also this element of the truth of trauma being a kind of perspective. It ties down to your idea of point of views. Like, okay, I think neurotic, or not neurotic, depressed people have this idea where, other people, they become this describes the paranoid personality, where they think everyone is out to fight, they're against them, but in reality nobody cares, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, like
absolutely.
Alex Jones.
Yeah.
Oh man, I'm pretty
Yeah, no,
fried.
yeah, yeah, man. I feel for the paranoid sort of yeah, the paranoid outlook. It must be a difficult way to relate to
Right,
the
because
world and other people. Everyone's out to get
that's
you. It's just fuck.
yeah,
You recoil from everything that's sort of difficult and creates, yeah, everything that's
it's
contradictory, everything that might displace you.
it's the big other, it's
Mm,
the third perspective taken to its logical
yeah,
conclusion. Yeah,
yeah. No, there was yeah, I'm definitely nearing the end here of my energy levels, but there was so much good stuff in
so
this,
many
and
good stuff.
I appreciate just having this just chatting with you guys. I mean, I
No, this
very
is fun.
no one else in my life that I could just be like, let's read Hegel and talk about it for 3 hours. It's a unique thing. It's unique to find like fucked up people who are into this kind of stuff.
I
It's
know, right?
awesome.
You You really have to be kind of fucked up. That's the non-rational right there. The fucked up.
Yeah. This is most people, it's just that's an utter waste
Ah.
of your time. I can't believe you're spending these 3 hours, 4
Yeah.
hours thinking about that. But yeah, there was a lot. I feel like pulling next time, I feel like pulling some definitions, let me say, or just some of these, because I feel like you had a lot of just logic is the science of truth, and then further down, I just saw this one is we now come to thinking. We have already called it thinking as the activation of the universal. Little pithy kind of lines like that. I feel
Amazing lines.
are
Yeah.
useful
The
to
simple
orient
self-reference.
around, because exactly,
Right.
because sometimes I'm like, oh, I forget. I feel like, oh fuck, I lose myself in the conceptual morass, and just to pull out some of those definitions, I think could be fun,
Yeah.
especially
think that-
prior to going into the science of logic.
Yeah, it's a great
Yeah, yeah.
introduction.
Absolutely. This is very good. This is very useful stuff. I think despite the length and the complication, we did okay. I think as far as I know.
Yeah,
I think
I
we
definitely want
yeah.
to finish this book
Yeah.
before Science of Logic. Like that would be.
That
I
would
think
be
that's a
that would be
great
interesting. There we
idea,
go.
because he
Let's
lays
do it.
out
Yeah.
representation versus thought, how they're different, like yeah, just some great conceptual distinctions that I think will be useful.
All right, let's
I
wrap
think
it
I'm
up.
done. All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Oh yeah, guys.
So
Yeah.
on and
See you guys
so on.
later. Bye bye.
See you later. Bye 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 bye.